Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. This short podcast is on two things. I am going to be reviewing a book. This is a book review. It's called America's Vietnam Policy, The Strategy of Deception by Edward Herman and Richard DeBoff. Basically, the subject matter of this book is the Johnson administration's approach to the Vietnam War and what his aims were. And we're going to talk shortly about, all the things that Johnson did and said during the discussion. And I'll probably have to do it in two segments because this book is, rather detailed and it has very specific information about the Vietnam War, including the mass murder campaign by the ethnic genocider, Mr. Lyndon Johnson. He puts Mr. Putin to shame. Okay, Mr. Johnson, if you read this book, he killed 2.6 million ethnic peasants. And when people asked him, what was the goal of your war or who was your enemy? He said the Vietnamese peasantry. That was his answer and his administration's answer to what actually they were fighting in Vietnam. They were not fighting the Viet Cong, nor were they fighting the rebel forces like the NLF, the National Liberation Front. They were fighting the peasants. So it was a genocide. It was basically an ethnic mass murder campaign by the U.S. government that puts Joseph Stalin to shame. Okay, the U.S. government's racist thugs, they're white frauds, and they're, media frauds covered this thing up so that nobody actually knows about the Vietnam War. And it's very important that people understand that the Vietnam War was covered up completely by racist whites in the American government. They covered up, they, propagandized and told the wrong information. They lied about different things in the war, and they, didn't even release accurate statistics. And so when scholars went through and looked later, they saw a pattern of indiscriminate bombings of civilian people, mass murders of villages razed to the ground, deliberate burning of villages while people were, living in them just to get to the small number of peasants. The word was the fish. In an ocean, you have to dry up the ocean to get the fish dead. All right. So that was the kind of stuff that, the generals in the army were saying. You have to dry up the ocean to get the fish dead. So, the Vietnam War, the ocean of, Vietnamese Buddhist peasants were going to be dried up, through, mass slaughter to get to the few Viet Cong, forces in South Vietnam. So we'll go through a few chapters of that. I think this is a good idea. Then there's the Iran War, day 32. This is, March 31st, 8 p.m. We're talking about U.S. and Israeli airstrikes continue through Iran with powerful explosions in Tehran and Isfahan. In an interview with Al Jazeera, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said communication with Tehran is ongoing, mostly through intermediaries, adding war objectives would be achieved in weeks, not months. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has threatened to destroy Iran's main oil export hub and energy infrastructure if no deal is reached soon. So, that is the racist gangsters of the U.S. government description of this, similar ethnic slaughter campaign of the Iranian Muslims. Okay, this is an ethnic slaughter campaign similar to Vietnam. They've slowed it down a little bit because, Johnson didn't know how to stop his, win policy, which, kept merging with genocide. Okay, he kept merging his win policy with genocide. And, the U.S. government seems to have slowed it down. But if they want to win this war, they will merge it with ethnic genocide of the Iranian Muslims. So, be aware of the danger of the racists of the American government. They are dirty frauds. They are, racist frauds that lie and cheat. They put lies in the media. They peddle, lies all over the case. And the media buys it sometimes, and the media is complicit with it in a patriotic farce sometimes. There are authors in the Wall Street Journal that work for military generals that are military generals or military officers that write for the Wall Street Journal. And there are, military generals that write for the New York Times. So, there's obviously a clear conflict of interest in this war of aggression that the U.S. government nonstop makes against people. So the Hormuz Plan, which the state media reported that a parliamentary commission approved tolls on vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, a key oil and gas route effectively closed by the war. Trump threatens the Karg Island. He has threatened to destroy Iran's oil exports in the hub of Karg Island, oil wells and power plants if no deal is reached. Apparently, Israel, U.S. Israel strike hits a steel plant, which is, an unusual event. He does not have an end to the war, but the U.S. has hit a steel plant and tried to, cause, mass problems for the Iranian government. The NATO allies continue to refuse to support the Iran war. Spain, France, and Switzerland specifically have imposed restrictions on U.S. military operations against Iran. That's an important fact that you should know. They're closing the airspace to American warplanes and blocking access to joint bases. Spain has barred the use of Naval Station Rota and Moron Air Base, both key hubs in Middle East operations. And Switzerland has suspended weapons exports to the U.S. worth roughly $120 million. Moves have drawn sharp criticism from Donald Trump as U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has warned Washington will re-examine the value of NATO once the conflict ends. Now, there is that day 32. There is the steel plant that was struck. I don't believe there's much information about it. I don't believe there's much information on this, steel plant. But basically, China and Pakistan released 5-point initiatives for restoring peace in the Middle East as Qatar's Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and President of the UAE Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed hold talks on the war in Iran and efforts to restore stability. There is some information about a steel plant that has been struck. But there's actually a Al Jazeera clipping, but be aware that a steel plant has been struck by the U.S. government. The video may contain light patterns and images that could trigger seizures or cause discomfort of people with visual sensitivity. So watch the video on Al Jazeera. I recommend it. I'll put the link in the discussion section. I'll put the name of the video in the discussion section. But those are the things that have happened. Day 32 again is filled with a couple events. We're talking that so strikes on Tehran. There's been constant bombardment. Tehran is skeptical of the United States talks. Mohammed Vali said Iranian leaders are focused on the war effort as they deeply distrust the United States. I don't blame them. I don't blame them to distrust the American frauds of the U.S. government. They are, racist gangsters of, Roman Catholicism. They, mass murder people who are ethnics. When you talk back to them, they shoot guns. They're white frauds, basically. They're white Roman Catholic frauds. So let's continue on. So he believes that Washington is not genuinely ready for ending the war and negotiating. So he believes this is a facade. This, discussion and this, end to the war in 2 to 3 weeks is a lie. That's what Mohammed Vali of the Iranian government is saying. He believes that it is a deep distrust, and he doesn't believe this war will end in 2 to 3 weeks. He believes that a regime change is going to begin, and they're just buying time for regime change. That is what he is saying. Iran's latest wave of attacks, the 87th month, was launched by the country's Navy. Very strong message to the United States, proving Washington's claims of obliterating Iran's naval forces is untrue. Tanziri, the Iran Revolutionary Guards Corps, was confirmed dead, and he was killed by an Israeli strike. war diplomacy. Pakistan and China are getting together and trying to, end this war. Ishaq Dar is visiting Beijing and is talking to Wang Yi following the weekend meetings in Islamabad with top diplomats from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. The G7 ministers pledge energy on action energy. They said they were ready to take all necessary measures to stabilize the energy market. Egypt's al-Sisi asked to help to stop the war. He says the President Trump will be the only one able to stop the war. Please help to stop the war, he says. President Sisi in Cairo says. UN slams Israel. UN alarms Israel death penalty law, criticizing Knesset for deep discriminatory death penalty bill of Palestinians convicted of any terrorist attacks. Applying it on occupied Palestinian territories is a war crime, according to the United Nations. NATO intercepts Turkey-bound missiles, the fourth since the start of the Middle East war. Paris surprised by Trump's remarks. President Macron was surprised by Trump's criticism of France as very unhelpful, and he refused to allow planes carrying military supplies to fly over the territory. And Infantino on Iran, FIFA chief Gianni Infantino said Iran will be at the World Cup and will play their group matches in the scheduled time. So those are the headlines from the Iran war. I think you should follow the news. And, there's no real way to know whether the U.S. government are lying or, telling the truth. They're deceptive frauds. They're deceptive frauds. The media are frauds. The U.S. mass media is frauds, and the U.S. government are frauds. They, propagandize and tell lies. So, hopefully we'll, at some point know it. But let's talk about how fraudulent they are. So that's one thing. Basically, in the introduction of this book, Edward Herman and Richard Duboff, very scholarly people, very smart people, have written a very good summary of, Johnson. And, basically they want to know there's a credibility gap in the American Vietnam policy. Okay, Washington claims of a deep interest in a negotiated settlement, but it was never ready to negotiate. Everything was a, buy for time, a stall for time, and, a time to regroup and, figure out how to, force the Viet Cong into submission. And, credibility of the United States has been impaired by the fact that at first the administration did not even pretend that it sought negotiations before escalating the war in North Vietnam in February 1965. March and April of that year, President Johnson expressed no interest at all in a negotiated settlement. So basically, in a nutshell, if you read Johnson's, all of his media statements, all of his statements to the press, all of his statements in his conferences, he gave several conferences at Johns Hopkins University. He basically, was, escalation. His war was a war of escalation, and it was a win policy. Okay, a win policy in Vietnam. Winning the war means that he wanted an independent Vietnam that was, controlled by the United States. It was a containment of China. It was a war to contain China. It was a war because, the United States, really, really wanted to take over China. They wanted that imperialist colony because they were ambitious, very ambitious people. And it's a secretive discussion, but they wanted an invasion of China, and China comes into this so many times. And the force that the United States put into this war was a slaughter campaign. Okay, they didn't, even check their, numbers when they were bombing. One day they said, we were, going to lower the amount, and then, 100,000 people were slaughtered in like 3 weeks. They had a ceasefire, and during the ceasefire, they had infiltrations. They broke the ceasefire. They broke all the discussions about it. But it was, a definite, one of the objectives of the U.S. government was to, take over China or contain China. It was going to be used as a base for Chinese expansionism and containment. The other aspects of it are that basically, the President Johnson never wanted to negotiate with the Vietnamese. He never wanted to negotiate. Many times, Ho Chi Minh attempted to reach Johnson for a settlement. Johnson's words were always, "We will not negotiate unless there is unconditional surrender." Okay, that was the words of Johnson. He wanted unconditional surrender of the Vietnamese in this war. And that is impossible. Okay, they are fighting for their independence. They've already been exposed and enslaved by the French in a colonial butcher campaign. The United States wanted to further that and continue that colonialism as the colonial heirs to France and Britain. And then they, didn't stop with any judgment. They had no judgment. Lyndon Johnson didn't have one judgment in this. Using a Vietnam win policy equated to genocide of the Vietnamese people. That was ultimately the end. The end result of a win policy in Indochina was genocide. And that is, really something that the mass murdering anti-ethnic thugs of the United States government need to understand. It's a humane issue for the United States. They don't understand that when you continue to bomb and, when you merge bombing with civilian slaughter for the sake of, killing those couple fish that are swimming in the ocean of civilians, you are equating genocide. You are on your way to genocide to win that war. And not only did Johnson continue it, but Nixon escalated. If you read after, Nixon escalated it. And it became a slaughter campaign and, equated to genocide. It was, equivalent to genocide. They were killing all of the civilians without even attacking the Vietnamese. Indiscriminate bombing. They dropped napalm and burned people. They dropped, Agent Orange and burned people. They destroyed crops and created an ecocide. It was a racist war of aggression of the United States government and the United States Army. And they did so many atrocious things in this war. I strongly urge people to pick up this book. And, there's another book. It's called After the Cataclysm, Noam Chomsky. It's, the political economy of human rights, part 2. And it is basically a study of American intervention post-Indochina, their actions and their comparison of their actions to the different countries. The official aims of the United States, I'm going to shortly say, is that, the Western presence in Indochina, after the fall of France in 1954, the United States wanted to replace it and maintain that, independence of South Vietnam. The United States wanted independence of South Vietnam. The legality and morality of the American position in Vietnam, the Geneva Accords of July 1954, which formally ended the 8-year French-Viet Minh War, did not partition Vietnam into two separate and independent nations. Therefore, Lyndon Johnson was, in his own world. He was a delusional fanatic that had no interest in the Geneva Conventions. He was just an American racist that wanted to, mass murder the ethnic niggers, as, the U.S. Army personnel put it in Vietnam. They wanted to mass murder the ethnic niggers of the Vietnamese people. And that's what's stated in books. There's a Filipino book, The Philippine Benign Intervention in the Philippines, that, they wanted to, murder the ethnic niggers of the Philippines. That's what they say. And that's the U.S. government's words. That's what they say on the side. We know what they say. We know how they behave. The Asians are ethnic niggers, mongrels of race, Asiatic mongrels, Asiatic potters. All that stuff are the U.S. government's jokes about, the ethnic people of Southeast Asia. Let's not, beat around the bush. They're racist gangsters of the Roman Catholic Church. They want only whites and they want only Roman Catholics in their exclusive club in the United States. And that is, ultimately what it is. So the United Nations and the Geneva Convention put forth several statements about what needed to happen in Vietnam. The most important of which was in July 1954, they needed to convene a election and decide who was going to rule Vietnam, both the North and the South. There was not the presence of a, line. There was not the presence of a line of the 32nd, parallel that was to be used to partition the two parts of the Vietnam. But the United States would not agree to the Geneva Conventions. They wanted a separate South Vietnam. And, after destroying many of the areas of South Vietnam, you can see why. They wanted big bases. They wanted big military installations, make a lot of, people, a lot of, weapons there. And then they wanted to attack China and they wanted to destroy North Vietnam. And, they didn't do it. They, ended up getting kicked out by force. And, that's, ultimately what it is. That's the fact of the matter. It's one of those things that happen. And it's an unfortunate situation. We see all the kinds of racist gangster actions. We have... So the forcible suppression of the Buddhists in the late spring of 1968 permitted the military junta to weaken seriously the only major legal organized force in the cities of South Vietnam. This set the stage for the ensuing emasculation of the electoral process by the South Vietnamese generals. General Khai declared unilaterally that the assembly to be elected September 11, 1966, would have no legislative or executive powers. Its function is merely to write a constitution after which it will be dissolved, with General Khai retaining power until well into 1987. According to the decree law issued by military junta to govern procedural rules for prospective assembly, the junta is privileged in writing of the Constitution as well. Amendments which are proposed by the junta can be rejected only by a 2/3 majority of the assembly. Thus, if the junta can influence slightly more than 1/3 of the deputies, it can virtually control the nature of the Constitution. General Khai announced that if free election were won by communists or neutralists, he would fight to prevent them from taking power. So no matter what the election result was, General Khai, the U.S. puppet in South Vietnam, would not accept it. Secretary Rusk quickly claimed that General Khai had been misquoted. Khai repeated his statement. Then Secretary Rusk then lapsed into a late silence. So the U.S. government, big propaganda show, Khai is lying. He's not telling the truth. And then you just shut up after he says it again. That's, the way to clarify things for everyone else. The confusion is, allow for mass slaughter. I mean, it gives you a window to mass slaughter. June 22nd, Electoral Commission appointed by the junta proclaimed that neither communists nor neutralists would be allowed to run for office, with the decision as to legitimacy resting solely with the Saigon government. Final step in the conversion of the elections into authoritarian comedy. So, basically the U.S. made a farce, a comedian farce of democracy in Vietnam. And, we have to, just accept that. Firepower and prolonged pacification are clearly a safer route to maintaining an independent South Vietnam than free elections, said Johnson's administration. Basically the Vietnamese people were, largely in charge of Vietnam. They were largely in pro NLF and pro liberation and pro Viet Minh. They were not interested in the U.S. Hegemony and the racist frauds of the United States. They, didn't want them. And, unfortunately, the U.S. government just never learns its lesson. It intervenes. It puts its meddling, butcherous hands of the Roman Catholics of the American government into everybody's business and slaughters like crazy. They, murder the ethnic niggers all over the world. And, happiness, they enjoy that feeling of empowerment, that racist feeling of oppression and power over people other than whites. So let's, we're going to talk the logic of escalation. In essence, the logic of escalation was basically, escalating allows us to not listen and have elections and negotiations. There's no reason to negotiate with the Vietnamese We want to escalate so that we can shut them up and, do whatever we feel like it. And that's basically what happened. It was a free-for-all in Vietnam. The U.S. war, one of the U.S. wars, not the only one actually, the Philippines War, many of the Mexicans wars, many of the South American wars were free-for-all for the U.S. government. It was open season on the colonial subjects. So you got to read all the history of the United States to know the racist butcher's history, because, it's pretty complex, and, there's a compendium of volumes on it. And, if you get into it, you might buy too many books, is what I strongly say that, I have done. And, I think it's a great thing. I think it's great to read these books, and I think it's great for knowledge. And I think you disseminate this knowledge. It's an excellent thing. I mean, I have all these books, and, it's very cheap. You can buy them on eBay. You can buy them on, Amazon. You can get them for $5 to $10. It's a great idea to buy these books. The diplomacy of a win policy, basically, win policy. Win policy was basically, started with Eisenhower and worked his way to Johnson. Eisenhower tried to get Winston Churchill, into the war. He was unsuccessful. John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower really wanted a white rogue coalition to attack the Vietnamese. They left no stone unturned to beat the Viet Minh and beat the North Vietnamese. They wanted Ho Chi Minh dead, and they wanted the Vietnamese dead. They wanted, a mass. They wanted control of Vietnam, strategic control. They got no support from Churchill and England. And, even after getting no support, they sort of helped. The British sort of helped them in kind of a subtle way. Basically, they work to, work with them. The British tried to work with them. Okay, the British tried to work with them. The French wanted out. Okay, the French wanted out. They wanted to get out, and they didn't understand why the Americans were trying to prolong this conflict if it was a win policy. Okay, everyone predicted that a win policy would result in genocide of the Buddhists of Vietnam, and the war on the peasants is always not a good idea for racist butchers. Like, you look really bad. You look really cruel and unusually sadistic. And that's how I would describe this. Was a sadistic war of aggression against the Vietnamese people. Okay, it wasn't against the military, it wasn't against the junta, it wasn't against any kind of warring factions. It was a sadistic war of mass murder aggression against the Vietnamese people. And just keep that in mind when you evaluate or think about the U.S. government in the future. It's really a dangerous group of white people that just don't know when to stop, when they get rattled up and feel that they are privileged enough to just be in charge, right? We got to be in charge of the Vietnamese. They're an inferior race. They can't really govern themselves. The same idea and ideology in Philippines. They're an inferior race. You got to get involved. So, through this win policy, it was, an unfortunate thing. Basically, Washington's unwillingness to engage in peaceful dialogue throughout the summer of 1964, and the made-up Gulf of Tonkin incident, again, another incident in which North Vietnamese warships allegedly struck U.S. forces and warships, from the Gulf of Tonkin. It was made up. It was made up to escalate and start a bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Until then, there was no bombing, but in 1964, following that aggression, there was a quick, unprovoked aggression by the Vietnamese, and the United States carried out its first aerial bombardment of North Vietnam. Okay, it was basically, it's a fraud. It was a fraud statement. It was an allegation that was based on lies. It was never verified, and the media never verified it, and it was a lie allegation. It was a fraud by the U.S. government. Basically. Basically, third-party mediation, like UTHANT of the North Vietnamese, asked for, negotiations, a discussion, third-party mediations with Europeans. No answer, no response. like uncivilized brutes, the U.S. government just kept bombing and bombing. They didn't have any interest in speaking to anyone. And, that's their traits. That's their traits. Unfortunately, I hate to say it. I was born and brought up here, and I have to say that, I don't really feel hate for the country. But I do feel that the government is a dangerous group of sadists. Okay, I do feel the government, when, even in normal time, even in peacetime, they're a great, dangerous group of sadists that don't know when to stop. I mean, with everyone, with everything and everyone. So, I don't know if you agree with that, but, that's just my opinion. And, it's not going to cause any problem. I'm pretty, settled and well. But, I think that everyone should be aware of, a mass murder campaign where you slaughter every civilian in the country is you really just, it puts Putin to shame. It puts, Joseph Stalin to shame. I mean, that's what I would say. It puts Joseph Stalin. I would say it would even put Adolf Hitler to shame. That would be my impression of such a, bombing campaign where they didn't even want to, think about stopping. So Johnson gave a bunch of addresses in which he lied blatantly to the American public. That's all written in here. He, created a pack of lies and stories about his, way of, discussing North Vietnam. He hid the fact that, the North Vietnamese were interested in negotiating after he put out a feeler to the North Vietnamese about negotiations. He hid the fact that they responded to that feeler, thinking that they wouldn't respond. They did respond after 2 weeks, and, that was when they had a deadline. They responded before that deadline, and he lied to the American public. It was finally found out like a year or two later, but, that's too late. Johnson was, long gone by the time it was found out. So there's no point. The diplomacy of a win policy, again, hundreds and hundreds of people slaughtered. Basically the diplomacy of a win policy was basically renewing the bombing of North Vietnam. They basically said that they put the Vietnamese question in many media statements, but they didn't make much of a statement. They just kept their escalation. I mean, they kept their, saturation bombing going. They were bombing peasants all over the place. They actually started bombing Laos. Johnson was bombing Laos at the same time. It was a secretive bombing, and, it kept going and going. Basically the summary of it was that, summary and conclusions is basically the best chapter in this book. It basically says that, the escalation of the war by the Johnson administration when Hanoi was ready to investigate in February 1965, but the United States refused outright. The New York Times claims that the decision to attack North Vietnam was made even earlier than October 1964, so that Johnson, had no real interest in 1964 to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. North Vietnam had responded to President Johnson's call for discussions in the bombing lull of April 1965. Hanoi's counter proposals were rejected by Washington as unacceptable, but the administration had said that in 1964, when they discussed these proposals, they said that they could be used and they were, able to negotiate. There was absence of any intention to negotiate by the Johnson administration based on, his ideas. Political concessions, Johnson would not give any. He would not allow the political concessions at all. He wanted unconditional surrender. He wanted unconditional, slaughter. I mean, that's basically what he did. That's what he wanted, and that's what he ended up doing. Basically, freedom of the Vietnamese people was incompatible with the policies of Lyndon Johnson and the United States. Okay, the United States and Lyndon Johnson's policies, freedom and self-determination for the Vietnamese people was incompatible. That was, basically the ultimate, fact of the war. They had no interest in, freeing and allowing self-determination. So basically, going on, basically the diplomatic, purpose of a no-win policy or a win policy is that you basically, you just keep, saying, no, I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to talk. We're going to win this war. We're going to win this war. He kept throwing it into the American public. The American public didn't really stop him. And, basically he just kept going. Failure to hold the elections in 1956. Again, the elections were required by the Geneva Conventions. The U.S. government failed to hold them. It's obviously another example of the U.S. government making its own rules and, housing international law. We are, just rubbish. This is rubbish. International law is rubbish. The Geneva Convention was rubbish. They broke the Geneva Convention over and over again. Never allowed the Vietnamese free elections, and they violated it in every way. They were not supposed to even have bases in Vietnam, but they did that. There were many stipulations of the Geneva Conventions. I'm sure I'll get to it. Independence, no way. The United States thought independence was for military dictatorships only. Any of the dictatorships of the U.S. government in Southeast Asia, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Thailand, Indonesia, those were allowed. Those were independent states. Anybody who wanted independence, like China and Vietnam, no deals. They were not considered sovereign states. They were not considered independent countries. These were the white racist butchers of the U.S. government. They wouldn't even acknowledge China. China did not become a member of the UN until the 1970s. Okay, so this is, the revolution in the Chinese Communist Party won in 1949. And so this is, 15, 20 years after, the government had changed. They were still acknowledging Taiwan as the Chinese government. The U.S. government was still acknowledging Taiwan as the Chinese government, and China had no place. Taiwan was on the UN, China was not. Chiang Kai-shek was represented on the UN, China was not. And unfortunately, Chiang Kai-shek was a mass murderer, and so his terrorist police state worked out for the United States. Anyone who butters up the U.S. government, white ethnic mass murderers, is a good guy, right? I mean, Chiang Kai-shek murdered his people. He murdered many ethnic, and he didn't have any hesitation in doing so. So that was aggression by whom? Basically, this is a chapter on who aggressed in the Vietnam War. He does a very solid, slow analysis, a patient analysis. And if you're patient and you read this, chapter, you'll understand that who was the aggressor? The United States was the aggressor. On every, point, the United States broke the rules. The United States broke the fine. I'm going to read the conclusion from the book just quickly. From the standpoint of 6 critical issues bearing on the charge of aggression, the failure to hold unifying elections in 1958, other major violations of the Geneva Agreements, the indigenous origins of the conflict in South Vietnam, the chief sources of expansion of the conflict, the relative amounts of external support for the contending parties in South Vietnam, and the degree of native support for the NLF and the Saigon governments, the verdict would appease to be this: the conflict in South Vietnam is civil in nature, and the United States, as the only major outside participant. The escalation of the war by the Johnson administration has transformed the United States from an interventionist in a civil war into an open aggressor nation. That is his conclusion by who is the aggressor. And then the last chapter is genocide in Vietnam. Basically, the Geneva Convention, ascribes 4 things as genocide: killing of members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. A common reaction among the American to the news that our armed forces are killing innocent civilians in Vietnam is, well, of course, that's deplorable. But innocent people die in every war, and this is no different. Unfortunately, this war is different, as much so that the ultimate logic of Americans' military policy in Vietnam appears to be genocide in terms of those definitions. So a logic of war of extermination basically is basically that, basically he goes through very, very systematically why he says that, the end point of this war is genocide. And, you should read this chapter. It's a great chapter, great book. If you have the time to, slowly go through it, you'll understand very specifically what he said. But in the end, he says, American military authorities are not ignorant of the dilemmas dilemma created by escalation and the wholesale killing of the engenders. In October 1963, General Westmoreland received the report of a special board on air firepower, which recommended that in most cases, South Vietnamese villages should not be bombed from the air before the villages have been warned to leave the area. The restraint would apply even in cases where light ground fire was received from the village. General Westmoreland was expected to accept the board's recommendations, but the report of the committee is still being studied and refined. However, it is scarcely even pretended that any efforts were made to protect or warn the civilian population. In fact, that would be contrary to the very logic of search and kill, since such warnings would be incompatible with effective hot pursuit. They would require an ability to weigh short-term military success against longer-term political consequences of actions, a skill which has normally eluded the American decision makers in Vietnam. The fate of General Westmoreland's special board on firepower and its recommendations may be judged by the answer given to Robert Gillen in February 1966 when he asked U.S. military officials what proportion of the reported 700 South Viet Cong killed in Operation Masher were civilians. In a Viet Cong area like that one, he said, civilian and military are all the same. So basically, they were indiscriminately bombing civilian people in a military, and very specific statistics are given on the actual point of the actual numbers of people that were slaughtered by the U.S. government as a result of the bombing campaign. Just in 3 years, 2.3 million people were slaughtered by the U.S. Armed forces in Vietnam. That's in 3 years. That's from 64 to 67. Okay, I don't even know if it includes 67. I think it's from 63 to 66 or 61 to 66. Okay, this war started around 1961. So from 61 to 66, 2.3 million people were slaughtered. After that, it's just infinite. I would say it's infinite number of casualties. I don't know how the Vietnamese actually even, survived this bombing campaign. The amount of firepower they had, it was just unparalleled. It was just like a butcher just unloading on poor people with guns and machine guns. Just like a bank robber that walks into a public place and just opens fire and she slaughters everyone in the building. I mean, that's the kind of war this showed, and that's the kind of mentality the U.S. government showed in this war. And Lyndon Johnson goes down as a paranoid schizophrenic, in my opinion. He becomes the delusional butcher of the U.S. government. He is a racist fraud, and he did the worst thing in Vietnam. And these are obvious facts. The native peasantry in the backbone of the NLF. The native peasantry is the backbone of the NLF and furnishes most of its manpower, food, and information. That entire group gradually becomes the target of American military actions, which have evolved into virtually unrestrained warfare against the entire Vietnamese peasantry. That much is made unmistakably clear by the systematic, massive use of the most modern firepower against innumerable peasant villages, the deliberate burning to the ground of peasant homes in village after village, and the spray killing of the food crops by chemical means is strongly NLF areas. In the eyes of U.S. commanders, destroying the peasant base of the guerrilla involvement is not brutality for its own sake. It is simply the most efficient means of achieving the desired military victory. The view is reflected on the statement by a high U.S. field commander reported in Saigon saying that if the people are to the guerrillas as the ocean is to the fish, then we are going to dry up that ocean, right? I mean, you dry the whole ocean to kill the 400 fish in the ocean. That's a terrible, terrible thought process. I mean, I don't know what kind of mental delusions that admiral or general has, but it's pretty severe. It's pretty severe sadism on that guy's part. Third, what makes such warfare feasible and even attractive is that the United States has the military power and technique to pursue it, while the other side does not. It is questionable whether any other war in history has seen such an incredible imbalance of firepower. In the real sense, the Johnson administration's escalation of the war in 1965 was directly related to this imbalance. Escalation represented Washington's decision to nullify the loss of the Civil War in South Vietnam by changing the rules of the game, by imposing on Vietnam a new brand of war in in which the United States has an overwhelming advantage. The new expanding war revolves around the methodological deployment of firepower dispensed by equipment and in amounts which no other power in the world can hope to match. In sum, the logic of American military escalation leads to nothing less than a war of extermination against the native Vietnamese peasantry, because the guerrillas cannot be segregated from the peasantry, because the peasantry provides the necessary broad base for the guerrillas, and because the United States has the military means to eradicate the base completely. It needs to create an independent South, if need be, to create an independent South Vietnam. Drying up the ocean, as suggested by the U.S. commander quoted above, is deliberately inflicting on the group, the peasant majority of South Vietnam, conditions of life calculated to bring about a physical destruction in whole or in part. The results are genocidal, and they fall into the same category whether the goal is the planned killing of entire groups on the principle as the Nazi extermination of the Jews, or whether the killing is done instead for political reasons because a group stands in the way of some chosen objective, as in the U.S. to achieve an independent South Vietnam, whatever the cause. Basically, such a campaign of extermination is a logical product of Western-type war-making applied to guerrilla movements broadly supported by the native population. An added fateful result of the methods is their indiscriminate character, often drives the population into the arms of the insurgents faster. For years, observers in Vietnam have pointed to this counterproductive feedback effect. The Pentagon itself estimates that the NLF has grown more since the escalation of the war than on any other period. But here is the catch. The feedback effect seems to be exactly what the Army and the Air Force want. Because once every peasant in an area is considered a Viet Cong, then the planes and helicopters can be at last used to their full extent in that area. Since everybody is an enemy, everybody and everything becomes a target. This is not institutionalized brutality. Rather, it reflects of the military mind, which immediately sets about convening the situation in its own way. From the military standpoint, it makes more sense to turn the entire population into an enemy and wipe them all out than to undertake a delicate task of responding to the legitimate complaints and legitimate aspirations of the Vietnamese population. The interaction between the systematic destruction and killing carried out by the U.S. forces and the feedback of additional recruits to the NLF reinforces the conclusion that genocide is the limit to the escalation process at work in Vietnam. And that, he documents the numbers. So, basically the U.S. government, they put everyone to shame. This war puts everyone to the shame. They are number one. I say they are number one, in ethnic mass slaughter. They are number one in racist slaughter. And, they are just number one in slaughter all ethnics. They are colonial racists. They're trying to continue their, hegemony, their colonial hegemony. Many books have written about it. Britain and the United States, they're buddies in colonial air. They wanted to become a co-colonial group that were, imperialists. They wanted a co-colonial group back in the 1800s to be co-colonialists and take over lands and, subjugate the people. They failed that they are a superior race of everyone else. But, the sadism, the sadistic sickness that the U.S. Army and the U.S. government had in this Vietnam War is unparalleled. There is no other country, no other group of people that has ever been this sick and sadistic ever in their murder campaigns. And there are a lot of murder campaigns in the world, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of mean, cruel people out there. But the U.S. government puts all of them to shame. All of them to shame with this sadistic, cruel slaughter campaign against the Vietnamese peasants. And you need only read this book, you'll get a good idea of how dangerous the U.S. government and its technology is. It is a racist group of sadistic butchers and, paranoid schizophrenics that are delusional about, what they think they're allowed to do. And, with a power drunkenness, they become grandeur delusionals that think that winning a war can include wiping out the entire population and, removing the entire population, in which then they can replace all their white, Roman Catholics into the land. So, let's be very careful watching the U.S. government in this Iran war. I know they've slowed it down, but, you never know the U.S. government's ideas and thoughts. They are, sadistic criminals of race and sadistic mass murderers of ethnics, putting all the rulers, all the wars to shame, I would say. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll put some of the information in the links in the description section. Have a great day. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.